This is preempted by the additional factors of faith, vigour, remembering, realization, and wisdom. I mentioned last time that these are actually the 5 spiritual faculties of Buddhism. I'm not going to get involved in whether Patanjali took these from Buddhism or not. Although it should be pointed out that, assuming that the Sutras were written down about 2,000 years ago, at that time, Buddhism was very much in the ascendance in India. It's curious that Patanjali does not say anything more about this. He just cites these 5 factors, the first one being faith. And I think I'm correct in saying that this is the only time that this word faith is mentioned in the Yoga Sutras. I'll say more about faith in a minute. I suspect that the reason Patanjali doesn't expand any further on each of these factors is that they were very well known. So well known that nothing more needed to be said about them. These are the qualities, these are the factors, these are the powers, as they're sometimes called, exercised by the spiritual practitioner, the enlightenment practitioner, the yogi. The Indologist George Feuerstein, in his comments about this, mentions that faith is nothing more than a positive attitude towards the yogic way of life. An English Buddhist called Sangharakshita, in his survey of Buddhism, gives quite a good description of what's meant by faith. But before I mention that, I just want to mention a quote that Sangharakshita makes. It's a quote from Dr. Conze, Dr. Edward Conze, who was one of the great translators of the Buddhist Mahayana scriptures. He says that, whereas before taking up the spiritual life, a man is dominated by his 5 senses, afterwards his conduct is increasingly guided by the 5 spiritual faculties. When, as a result of constant exercise, these faculties have become so strong that they can no longer be crushed by the passions, they are termed balas, powers or forces. And these factors are what we need to keep us from getting caught up in our psychological disposition and getting lost in our conviction in dualistic thinking. So the first of these factors is faith. And according to Sangharakshita, the word for faith, shraddha, is connected to a verb meaning to place one's heart on. So it's emotional in character. It's what you place your heart on. And it's not faith in the sense of belief. It's faith in the sense of confidence. You know the reality of realization. You know the reality of your own awareness. You have placed your heart on it. This is what you need to keep coming back to. And this is what fuels our vigour, our energy. This gives us our energy. And our energy is devoted to placing our heart on realization. The next faculty is usually translated as mindfulness, but it's our old friend Smriti from Sutra 11. Now Sangharakshita quotes the Buddha's description of these faculties from the Samyutta Nikaya. And what monks is the faculty of mindfulness? Herein, monks, a noble disciple is mindful, endowed with supreme skill in mindfulness, one who remembers and calls to mind both what has been done and what has been spoken long ago. This, monks, is called the faculty of mindfulness. The Buddha is clearly talking about memory here, or remembering. The Buddhists have a very particular understanding of mindfulness. It's very much about being present in the moment. And you often see the Buddhists practicing their mindfulness very somberly. But it's about memory. And this remembering is important to see how we keep repeating the same patterns over and over and over again. We need to be aware of our patterns so that we don't get sucked into them again. It takes a very special degree of honesty and integrity to not deceive oneself about one's own reality. So it's about a very acute and honest observation of yourself, of your patterns. So once we're aware of the patterns which take us away from samadhi, we can then abide in samadhi once again. We come back to abiding in our own awareness, realization of our own awareness once again. So this very samadhi is the fourth of the spiritual faculties, the fourth of the spiritual powers. And the fifth one is wisdom, or prajna. And I think we can understand this as just being very, very clear about what needs to be done. Being very clear about our situation, about how we move from realization, from self-remembering to self-forgetfulness, and knowing when we're in a state of self-forgetfulness, and coming back to what we've placed our heart on. Actually, it's a bit like living with a loved one and not falling into the trap of taking them for granted, not letting them fade into the background, but always keeping them in the foreground. So this is wisdom. This is the wisdom of prajna, being fully aware of the dynamic of the situation, the dynamic by which we come into awareness and then forget it, and then come into it again.